The 1990s were supposed to be Hollywood's golden era of blockbusters. Instead, studios burned through hundreds of millions chasing disasters they now pretend never existed. We're talking careers derailed, studios bankrupted, and films so catastrophically bad that executives still get cold sweats thinking about them. Ever wonder which movies made Hollywood collectively agree to never speak of them again? Here are 15 absolute train wrecks. Last Action Hero, 1993. Arnold Schwarzenegger was absolutely untouchable in the early 90s. Terminator 2 had just obliterated box office records, and the Austrian oak could seemingly do no wrong. Then, Columbia Pictures decided to let him make a meta-action comedy that satirized his own career, and the results were nothing short of a spectacular faceplant that left everyone scratching their heads, wondering what went wrong. Last Action Hero cost a staggering $85 million to produce, which was astronomical money back in 1993. The concept sounded clever on paper. A young kid gets a magical movie ticket that transports him into his favorite action franchise alongside his hero Jack Slater. The problem was that nobody quite knew what kind of film they were watching. Was it a parody, a genuine action movie, a family adventure? The film couldn't decide, and neither could audiences. The marketing campaign was one of the most aggressive ever attempted. Columbia literally paid $500,000 to paint Schwarzenegger on an actual rocket. NASA approved a promotional campaign featuring the film's logo on a space mission. None of it worked. The movie opened against Jurassic Park and got absolutely demolished at the box office, earning only $50 million domestically against its massive budget. Critics called it bloated, confused, and weirdly condescending to the very genre it was supposedly celebrating. Director John McTiernan, fresh off Die Hard glory, couldn't salvage the overstuffed script. Schwarzenegger himself admitted years later that the film tried to be too many things at once and ended up being nothing memorable at all. Hudson Hawk, 1991. Bruce Willis was riding the Die Hard wave into superstardom when he decided to make the passion project that would nearly torpedo his entire career. Hudson Hawk represents perhaps the most infamous vanity project of the entire decade, a bizarre musical heist comedy that Willis had co-written and desperately wanted to bring to life, regardless of whether audiences actually wanted to see it. The plot involves a cat burglar forced to steal Leonardo da Vinci artifacts for a couple of deranged billionaires, played by Richard E. Grant and Sandra Bernhard. Willis sings old standards while committing robberies. There are references to Cappuccino, and the whole thing plays like an inside joke that nobody outside the production understood. TriStar Pictures watched in horror as their $65 million investment became a laughingstock. Opening weekend brought in barely $8 million. The total domestic haul limped to $17 million, making it one of the most embarrassing theatrical releases of the year. Critics were absolutely vicious. Roger Ebert called it a movie about nothing. Other reviewers questioned whether Willis had simply lost his mind or was intentionally sabotaging his own career with this incomprehensible mess. The film became shorthand in Hollywood for what happens when a star gets too much creative control without anyone willing to say no. Willis himself defended the movie for years before finally admitting it probably should have been weirder or more conventional, but definitely not the awkward middle ground where it landed. The Hudson Hawk disaster took years to live down. Super Mario Bros. 1993. Before video game adaptations became their own profitable genre, Hollywood decided to prove exactly why movies and games should never mix. Super Mario Bros. Stands as the original sin of video game cinema, a production so troubled and a final product so baffling that it poisoned the well for adaptations for nearly 30 years afterward. Bob Hoskins and John Leguizamo signed on expecting a fun family adventure. What they got was a nightmarish shoot helmed by husband and wife directors Rocky Morton and Annabelle Jankel, who constantly fought with the studio about tone and vision. Hoskins later called it the worst job he ever did. Leguizamo confirmed they were drinking whiskey between takes just to survive the chaos. The $48 million production transformed the colorful Nintendo world into a grimy, dystopian hellscape. Dennis Hopper played King Koopa as some kind of slicked-back lizard businessman. The Goombas became giant humans with tiny dinosaur heads. Nothing resembled the source material that millions of kids adored, and parents dragging children to theaters were met with confused crying rather than delighted cheering. The box office results were disastrous. Just over $20 million domestic against that massive budget. Nintendo was reportedly so embarrassed that they stayed away from Hollywood adaptations for decades until finally allowing the animated Mario movie that became a smash hit in 2023. Super Mario Bros. Remains the cautionary tale that every studio executive remembers when greenlighting video game projects today. The Island of Dr. Moreau, 1996. Sometimes a movie becomes legendary not for what ends up on screen, but for the absolute chaos that occurred behind the cameras. The Island of Dr. Moreau is cinema's most infamous production disaster, a film so plagued by ego clashes, reshoots, and bizarre behavior that the documentary about its making is more entertaining than the actual finished product. Richard Stanley was originally hired to direct this H.G. Wells adaptation. 3 days into shooting, New Line Cinema fired him after Val Kilmer reportedly became impossible to work with and demanded his role be reduced. Stanley was escorted off-set and literally had to sneak back, disguised as a Dogman extra, just to watch the carnage unfold. John Frankenheimer was brought in to save the production and immediately clashed with everyone. Marlon Brando showed up weighing over 300 pounds and refused to learn his lines. He wore an ice bucket on his head during one scene and demanded a tiny, identical mini-me actor be added to accompany him everywhere. Kilmer continued antagonizing everyone, supposedly mimicking Brando to his face. Frankenheimer later called it the worst experience of his career and said he would rather die than ever work with Val Kilmer again. The $40 million film earned only $27 million domestically. Critics savaged it as incomprehensible garbage. The entire debacle became required reading in film schools about how productions can spiral completely out of control when nobody is willing to walk away from obvious disasters. North, 1994. Roger Ebert wrote perhaps the most famous negative review in film criticism history for this Rob Reiner disaster. His opening line declared that he hated this movie. He hated the story, the characters, and the very concept. He wasn't finished. The review continued expressing hatred for seemingly every single frame, actor choice, and creative decision. North earned this legendary takedown honestly. The premise involves Elijah Wood as a precocious kid who divorces his neglectful parents and travels the world auditioning replacement families. He visits stereotypical versions of Texas, Hawaii, China, and other locations, each sequence more embarrassingly tone-deaf than the last. Bruce Willis appears repeatedly as a guardian angel-type figure, and the whole thing plays like a fever dream from someone who actively dislikes children. Rob Reiner had just come off A Few Good Men and Misery. His career was untouchable. North demolished that goodwill overnight. The $40 million production earned barely $7 million domestically, becoming one of the most embarrassing theatrical releases of 1994 by a wide margin. Critics joined Ebert in expressing confusion about how so much talent produced something so thoroughly unwatchable. The film's reputation has only worsened over time. Various sequences involving ethnic stereotypes play horrifyingly today. Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Dan Aykroyd, and numerous other talented performers gave what they probably considered cute cameos, but now look like career lowlights. North represents the moment Rob Reiner's Midas touch vanished completely and permanently. Judge Dredd, 1995. Sylvester Stallone was attempting to launch a new franchise after the Rocky and Rambo wells had dried up. Judge Dredd seemed perfect. The brutal British comic character existed in a dystopian future where police served as judge, jury, and executioner. Hard R-rated material perfect for the action star's wheelhouse. Instead, Hollywood interference transformed potentially great source material into a neutered mess that satisfied absolutely nobody. The production constantly battled between those wanting faithful comic adaptation and those demanding family-friendly summer blockbuster. Stallone insisted on removing his helmet for most of the film, a decision that infuriated comic fans since Dredd's face is never shown in the source material. Director Danny Cannon reportedly fought constantly with the star and lost every argument about the film's direction. Budget estimates placed production costs around $90 million. The domestic return barely cleared $34 million. International markets were kinder but not enough to save the film from being considered a massive disappointment. Critics called it loud, dumb, and completely missing what made the comics compelling in the first place. Rob Schneider was cast as the comedic sidekick, a choice that confused everyone who wanted the grim, violent Dredd experience. The one-liner heavy script felt recycled from better Stallone vehicles. 20 years later, Carl Urban would deliver the Judge Dredd adaptation fans always wanted in Dredd 2012, a film that succeeded precisely by avoiding every single mistake this version made so spectacularly. The Scarlet Letter, 1995. Adapting classic literature to film is always risky. Completely rewriting the ending because audiences might find the original too depressing is creative suicide. The Scarlet Letter took Nathaniel Hawthorne's American classic and transformed it into an erotic thriller with a happy ending that made English teachers everywhere want to throw their textbooks through windows. Demi Moore was at peak stardom following Ghost and A Few Good Men. She pushed hard for this adaptation, reportedly wanting a prestige project that would cement her dramatic credentials. Instead, she delivered what critics called one of the most misguided literary adaptations ever attempted. The infamous marketing tagline actually bragged that the film was freely adapted from the novel, essentially admitting they'd changed everything. Director Roland Joff added scenes of Moore bathing while Native Americans watched. The climactic scaffold scene was replaced with an Indian attack and last-minute rescue. Hester Prynne and Reverend Dimmesdale ride off together into happiness, completely negating Hawthorne's entire thematic point about guilt, sin, and societal punishment. Test audiences reportedly demanded the changed ending. The $50 million production earned barely $10 million domestically. Razzie Awards showered the film with nominations. Critics called it insulting to anyone who'd actually read the source material. The Scarlet Letter became shorthand for Hollywood arrogance, assuming modern audiences needed classic stories dumbed down and given uplifting conclusions they never earned or deserved. Cutthroat Island, 1995. This is it, the film that literally destroyed a studio. Cutthroat Island holds the Guinness World Record for largest box office loss relative to budget, a catastrophe so complete that Coralco Pictures went bankrupt and pirate movies were considered cursed for an entire decade until Johnny Depp showed up with eyeliner and changed everything. Gina Davis starred as a pirate captain hunting treasure while battling her evil uncle. Director Rennie Harlin, who happened to be married to Davis at the time, pushed for increasingly expensive action sequences. The budget ballooned from $40 million to over $98 million, astronomical money that required the film to earn at least $200 million just to break even. Opening weekend brought in barely $2 million. Final domestic total was under $10 million. International markets added barely enough to reach $30 million worldwide. The studio collapsed. Multiple executives lost their jobs. The Harlan-Davis marriage crumbled shortly afterward. Insurance companies spent years sorting through the financial wreckage. Critics weren't even particularly harsh. Most called it a competent adventure film that simply wasn't anything special. The problem was that competent and unspecial couldn't justify the insane spending. Cutthroat Island proved that Hollywood accounting could literally bankrupt companies overnight when runaway productions met audience indifference. The pirate genre wouldn't recover until 2003, when Pirates of the Caribbean proved audiences would return for the right swashbuckling story. Johnny Mnemonic, 1995. Keanu Reeves was still finding his footing as a leading man when he signed on for this William Gibson adaptation about a data courier with computer hardware implanted in his brain. the cyberpunk aesthetic and source material seemed promising. The execution was anything but. Johnny Mnemonic became a punchline about 90s technological anxiety, translated through the most embarrassing dialogue imaginable. The film opens with Reeves screaming about wanting room service and getting his shirts laundered. He plays a man who stores corporate data in his head, but has deleted his own childhood memories to make room. Dolph Lundgren appears as a street preacher assassin. Ice-T leads a group of rebels. Henry Rollins plays a doctor. The casting choices seem designed to confuse everyone about target demographics. Director Robert Longo was a visual artist making his first feature film. His inexperience showed in every awkwardly staged scene and poorly paced sequence. The studio reportedly cut 30 minutes from his original vision, leaving behind a choppy narrative that confused critics and audiences alike. $26 million budget, $19 million domestic gross, complete disaster. Critics called it laughable and dated despite being set in the future. The irony is that Gibson's original short story predicted much of our actual technological present quite accurately. The film version just couldn't translate those ideas into compelling cinema. Reeves would get his proper cyberpunk triumph with The Matrix 4 years later. Speed 2, Cruise Control, 1997. Lightning rarely strikes twice, but studios insist on trying anyway. Speed was a genuine phenomenon. The Keanu Reeves bus thriller earned over $350 million worldwide and announced Sandra Bullock as a major star. The sequel replaced the bus with a cruise ship, replaced Reeves with Jason Patric, and replaced thrills with boredom. Audiences could smell the desperation. Keanu Reeves reportedly turned down $15 million to reprise his role because he thought the script was terrible. Smart man. The plot involves a cruise ship hijacked by a disgruntled computer genius, played by Willem Dafoe. The problem with setting an action thriller on a massive, slow-moving vessel is that nothing feels urgent. The ship crawls toward a Caribbean village for what feels like 17 hours. Director John DeBont had orchestrated genuine tension in the original film. Here, he seemed completely lost on how to generate excitement from a vehicle whose top speed might hit 15 knots on a good day. The $160 million budget funded impressive practical effects, but no actual thrills. Critics called it bloated and boring. Domestic gross landed around $48 million. The film essentially buried DeBont's directing career. Sandra Bullock later expressed regret for signing on and called Speed 2 a turning point where she learned to trust her instincts about scripts rather than studio promises. The cruise ship action thriller subgenre hasn't recovered since. The Postman, 1997. Kevin Costner had already tested audience patience with the troubled Waterworld production. Instead of retreating to safer territory, he doubled down with an even more expensive post-apocalyptic epic that cast himself as a wandering drifter who accidentally inspires hope by pretending to be a mail carrier. The Postman is 3 hours of Costner gazing heroically into the distance while civilization rebuilds around his magnificent hair. The source material was David Brin's novel about symbols and community in a collapsed America. Costner directed himself wandering through beautiful Oregon landscapes, delivering mail, fighting warlords, and generally behaving like the most important person in any room despite everyone clearly wanting him to leave. The self-indulgence was overwhelming. Budget estimates placed production costs around $80 million. Marketing pushed that past $100 million. Domestic returns were barely under $18 million. International audiences were equally uninterested. The Postman became synonymous with Costner's ego unchecked, a vanity project that tested even his most devoted fans. Critics were savage. They called it overlong, self-congratulatory, and laughably pretentious. The Razzie Awards gave it 5 wins, including Worst Picture and Worst Director. Costner's streak of ambitious failures had exhausted goodwill built from Dances with Wolves and Field of Dreams. Hollywood stopped handing him blank checks afterward, and his career shifted toward smaller projects and supporting roles for the next decade. The Avengers, 1998. Long before Marvel dominated multiplexes, there was a British television series from the 1960s about stylish secret agents fighting bizarre villains. Warner Brothers decided this property deserved a big-budget Hollywood adaptation starring Ralph Fiennes and Uma Thurman. What emerged from production was so incomprehensible that even the actors couldn't explain what they'd filmed. Sean Connery plays a weather-controlling megalomaniac in a teddy bear costume. That sentence should tell you everything about where this production went wrong. Director Jeremiah Chechik reportedly delivered a cut running over 2 hours. The studio panicked, hacked 50 minutes out, and released something that made absolutely no narrative sense to anyone watching. The $60 million budget seemed reasonable for a summer action film. Marketing added millions more. Opening weekend brought barely $10 million. Final domestic was under $24 million. Warner Brothers executives reportedly refused to screen the film for critics, hoping word of mouth might somehow save them. It didn't. Fiennes and Thurman both seemed embarrassed during promotional interviews, unable to explain the plot or defend the finished product. Critics who did see it called the film an incoherent mess with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. The Avengers became a cautionary tale about adapting beloved properties without understanding what made them beloved in the first place. Warner Brothers absorbed the loss and pretended it never happened. Sphere, 1998. A 300-year-old spacecraft discovered at the bottom of the ocean containing an alien artifact that grants wishes. The premise sounds incredible. The cast included Dustin Hoffman, Sharon Stone, and Samuel L. Jackson at peak popularity. Barry Levinson directed. Michael Crichton wrote the source novel. Everything suggested prestige science fiction that would terrify and enlighten. What audiences got was 2 hours of talented people standing around looking confused. The production reportedly went through multiple script rewrites, trying to crack the story's inherent problems. Crichton's novel worked as an internal psychological exploration. Translating that to screen meant watching actors describe fears, while not much happened visually. Levinson tried adding set pieces, but they felt disconnected from the central mystery. Warner Brothers spent $80 million on the production. Marketing pushed it toward summer blockbuster status, with trailers promising underwater thrills. Opening weekend was decent at $13 million, but terrible word of mouth killed momentum immediately. Final domestic was barely $50 million, a disaster for the budget involved. Critics called it boring, confusing, and a complete waste of assembled talent. Hoffman seemed particularly miscast as an academic suddenly facing cosmic horror. The ending resolves through characters simply deciding to forget everything happened, which critics noted was exactly what audiences were trying to do as credits rolled. Sphere demonstrated that even perfect ingredients could produce thoroughly forgettable results. Wild Wild West, 1999. Will Smith was the biggest movie star on the planet. He had just delivered Men in Black and Independence Day back-to-back. Warner Brothers offered him anything he wanted. He chose to remake a forgotten 1960s television western with steampunk robots and a giant mechanical spider. The results were so catastrophic that Smith has spent decades apologizing and blaming the experience for turning down The Matrix. Director Barry Sonnenfeld reunited with Smith expecting another Men in Black level hit. Instead, they produced an unfunny mess featuring uncomfortable racial humor, incomprehensible action sequences, and Kevin Kline doing double duty that nobody asked for. Kenneth Branagh played a legless Confederate villain with an 8-story spider machine. The tonal chaos was exhausting. Budget estimates ranged from $170 to $200 million when marketing was included. Opening weekend seemed promising at over $50 million. Then word of mouth destroyed everything. Final domestic was barely over $113 million, meaning the film needed massive international success just to break even. It didn't get it. Razzie Awards gave Wild Wild West 5 wins, including Worst Picture. Critics called it obnoxious, bloated, and weirdly unpleasant, despite the blockbuster pedigree. Smith later revealed he turned down Neo in The Matrix to make this disaster, a decision he's called the worst of his career. Warner Brothers absorbed hundreds of millions in losses and quietly buried Wild Wild West in the vault. Batman and Robin, 1997. This is the big one. The superhero film so catastrophically bad that it killed an entire franchise for 8 years and nearly convinced studios that comic book adaptations were poison. Batman and Robin didn't just fail. It became legendary shorthand for Hollywood excess, studio interference, and creative bankruptcy, reaching their absolute nadir. George Clooney inherited the cape from Val Kilmer and immediately found himself drowning in neon, ice puns, and anatomically detailed costumes that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. Director Joel Schumacher received notes from Warner Brothers demanding more toys, more villains, more everything that could be merchandised. The resulting film featured Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze delivering approximately 47 ice-related one-liners. The $125 million budget created elaborate sets that looked like they cost $10. Uma Thurman vamped as Poison Ivy, while Alicia Silverstone arrived as Batgirl with zero explanation. Bane was reduced to a monosyllabic henchman. The Batsuit had visible nipples because apparently someone thought that was acceptable design. Domestic gross was barely over $107 million against that massive budget plus marketing. Warner Brothers had expected $400 million minimum. Clooney has apologized publicly multiple times for the film. Schumacher apologized to fans before his death. The Batman franchise was put on ice until Christopher Nolan proved audiences would return for serious treatment with Batman Begins in 2005. Batman and Robin remains the textbook example of franchise destruction through corporate greed. The 90s proved that no star was too big, no budget too large, and no franchise too beloved to survive Hollywood's worst impulses. These 15 disasters collectively lost studios over $1 billion and ended countless careers. Which forgotten flop do you think deserved better? Which one should have buried careers permanently? Drop your hottest takes below. And here's the real question that should haunt every executive. If we've forgotten these catastrophes existed, what colossal failures are we pretending aren't happening right now?